I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 44. Planning the Defensive Line. 24th August 1990. 82nd Airborne Headquarters, Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The fight in Medina was winding down. It had been swift and brutal. The 2nd Republican Guard Corps, with the 7th Adnan Division in the north and the 5th Baghdad Division to the south of Highway 60, had taken 10 days to move from Buraydah to the outskirts of Medina. During that time, delaying actions by the elements of the 45th Saudi Armored Brigade and airstrikes from U.S. assets had mauled the 7th Adnan Division. The 5th was a bit more fortunate, as this division was not using the highway and had thus largely not been tracked or monitored like the 7th had been. For the past 5 days, the two divisions had been concentrating on capturing Medina. The Saudi National Guard forces were making it a house-to-house fight, especially against elements of the 7th Division. The 5th Division had engaged in the southern suburbs of Medina, but had been ordered to bypass the city and get to the coast. It appeared that once the 5th had opened the passes to the coast, the 2nd Army Corps would follow and conduct a passage of lines and move to the coast to seize Jeddah from the Americans. It had now been 20 days since the Iraqi army had crossed the Saudi border, without much of a pause. They were running an absolute blitzkrieg of an operation, one that had stunned not only the Saudis, but also the Americans and the rest of the world. This blitz across the desert, however, was beginning to show in the maintenance state of the Iraqi equipment. A pause at this time would be a smart play, a good opportunity to consolidate, refit, and rearm before making the next lunge. However, Saddam and his generals weren't trying to play it safe. They weren't trying to play it smart. They were playing to win and gambling their entire army in the process. General Buckner was feeling better about their situation now that he had all 3 brigades in country and they were fully deployed to their sectors. The division artillery was in position, and 2 battalions of 105s and a battalion of 155s had been emergency airlifted to Jeddah by any and all Mil Air and commercial air transports available, along with at least 2 weeks of munitions for a heavy fight. Everyone knew the next 5 to 10 days were going to make or break things in Saudi Arabia. Buckner only wished he had more firepower. The Air Defense Battalion had also arrived in force. This was a welcome addition, although the towed Vulcan air defense weapon wasn't nearly as effective as the Iraqi ZSU-23-4 or even the ZSU-57-2. The Stinger missiles were effective, but there just weren't enough of them. If they started to get hit by waves of Huns, things could get really interesting for them. During the last 24 hours, as the battle for Medina Ridge drew closer, he'd moved the Division Tactical Command Post, or TCP, to the center sector so he could monitor the battle as it unfolded. It quickly became evident that FM radio communication was going to be a problem at these distances and in this terrain. All of the brigade commanders were meeting with him this morning to go over their plan for the defense of their respective sectors. It might be one of the last times they all met together like this for a long time. Colonel Joe Kinser had been a brigade commander for almost 18 months. He was older than most brigade commanders, having been a staff sergeant. After a tour in Vietnam, he decided to make the Army a career and had gone to officer candidate school. His nickname among his soldiers was Smoking Joe, and he was dearly loved by them. He could easily identify with his soldiers, and they really respected him as a man and an officer. "Joe, why don't you start us off?" General Buckner said, looking at the man, who was several years older than he was. "Yes, sir," Kinzer said as he stood and moved to the map board, which was covered in acetate. He picked up a pointer and began. "Sir, we're defending from Al Medina in the north to this point in the south, as was agreed between me and Bob. Highway 340 is the major road through my sector with a few trails scattered throughout. I'm positioning the 1st Battalion 504th in the north, along the ridge to this outcrop. He will cover the road connecting Highway 15 in the east to Highway 15 in the west, and Highway 8240. 2nd Battalion will defend from there to south of this unmarked highway. The 3rd Battalion will cover Highway 340 and Highway 60 and south, linking up with 2nd Brigade. Naturally, 3rd Battalion will be my main effort, and I've attached my engineer company to him for preparing that road. Priority of artillery fire is to 3rd Battalion. This is a wide sector, sir, but really the only places that we could expect serious trouble are in Al-Mufrihat and along Highway 340. There are several foot trails through all the sectors, and all can be easily controlled. I have the Cav troop screening up Highway 15 to Buat in the north. I'm feeling fairly confident at this point, sir. What are your questions?" Colonel Kinzer concluded confidently. "Sounds like you have it covered," General Buckner acknowledged. "I'll bet he's already played this battle over 1,000,000 times in his head and accounted for damn near everything that's going to happen. I'm damn glad to have him here. He's going to be my rock this defensive effort will be built upon." Joe added, "Sir, the one concern I do have is Highway 15, which comes out of Medina and passes through Al-Mindasa, going north to Tabuk. I'm concerned that I may find part of the 2nd Army Corps coming down that road about the time I have the 2nd Republican Guard Corps coming down on Highway 340. Buckner chewed on his lower lip for just a moment before replying. He stood up and walked over to the map board to walk them through something. "That's a valid concern, Joe. It's also why I put the one troop from our only Cav unit and their vehicles on your flank. They'll be in constant contact with you. If they spot something, you'll be the first to know. They're more than capable of covering your flank, especially with Div Arty on standby. Let's not forget we also have the 10th Sudi Mech harassing the lead elements of the 2nd Corps as they move south." Surveying his commanders, Buckner smiled as he informed them, "I was saving this for the end of the brief, but now seems like a good time to tell you guys. An hour ago I was informed by General Luck that the 511th Tactical Fighter Squadron out of RAF Alconbury in England arrived across the Suez 12 hours ago. Their pilots are resting up right now, but they'll be on standby to assist us, and only us, for the foreseeable future. A squadron of A-10s is going to make a big difference in this coming battle, guys. Does this alleviate some of your concerns, Joe?" "Yes, sir, it does a lot," Colonel Kinzer replied, with a look of genuine relief on his face as he took a seat. The rest of the briefing was more of the same, each brigade commander going over the disposition of their battalions and how they were going to handle the Iraqi formations arrayed before them. The outcome of this very war could be decided by what happened next. Chapter 45. Battle of Medina Ridge. 21st August 1990. 1st Brigade, 82nd Airborne. Medina, Saudi Arabia. 1st Brigade, 82nd Airborne Division, had moved into positions on the 18th. Colonel Kinzer had gone over the ground with his battalion commanders, and they had done the same with their company commanders, who did the same with their platoon leaders. Leaders' recons, as they were called, were paramount in a successful defense. In this terrain, the problem wasn't so much going to be enemy armor as it was enemy infantry. The 5th and the 7th Republican Guard divisions weren't armored divisions, so each division only had 78 tanks, although they had been upgraded to the newest Russian T-72s. Some had been lost in the previous days, but their numbers were still large. This kind of terrain was going to restrict the tanks, but not the infantry. These divisions were packing many thousands of infantry soldiers, soldiers who'd be hell-bent on isolating the defending paratroopers and wiping them out. The senior NCO manning the TOC had taken some time and built up a really nice sand table with the appropriate symbols and figures so the commanders could lay out their plan visually. The NCO was meticulous in building the terrain model as exactly as possible, with the appropriate roads, wadis, and hilltops indicated. "Sergeant First Class," Colonel Kinzer said, getting the NCO's attention, "you should be a model builder for Disney Productions when you get out. This is a perfect replica of our sector." "Thank you, sir. Glad to do it," the man said, feeling a lot of pride as all the battalion commanders were standing there. "Okay, First Bat, let's hear your plan," Colonel Kinzer said. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Walker stood and approached the sand table. Brigade and battalion boundaries were already marked on the sand table, with blue yarn delineating the battalion boundaries. Walker picked up 3 oval cutouts representing company defensive positions and placed one aside the 2 roads leading from Medina west and one in the back of his battalion sector where those 2 roads converged. He also laid down a symbol for his battalion mortars. "Sir, in my sector, I have 2 paved roads running east to west, and 1 road, Highway 15, approaching from the north and splitting to run east and west of my positions. I'm accepting risk on my northern flank, as north of us somewhere are elements of the 10th Saudi Mechanized Brigade, and the 1 troop of the Division Cav Squadron is screening along that flank. In the east, I've placed 1 rifle company across each road, and my 3rd company in depth, where those 2 roads intersect. Priority of fires is to the southern company, as I believe that's where the main threat will come, and it'll be the BTR 70s and 80s. I doubt they'll run their T-72 out front, as this division doesn't have that many, and will be holding them in reserve to exploit any breakthrough." Lieutenant Colonel Walker cast a sideways glance at the 2nd Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ellison, through John's sector. Ellison had been a classmate of Walker's at West Point, and the 2 had been competing against one another their entire careers. West Point officers came in 3 profiles. The first profile was those that you could look at, and just know they were destined to enter the general officer ranks. They were generally very focused, but very good-natured. They were mentors to junior officers and compadres to any officers, regardless of where they got their commissions. Then there were the West Point graduates that were called ring knockers, because they wore the huge ring and made it very obvious where they had gone to school. Some had never left the parade field at West Point, and their wives easily wore their rank. They would stab another officer in the back to get ahead, and some made it to general officer by climbing over the bodies of those they stabbed along the way. And then there were the incompetent officers. These guys might have been book smart, but they were short on common sense. Definitely not general officer material, and they usually finished their army careers before they could retire, or they retired as lieutenant colonels, having been passed over for colonel. Ellison and Walker fit the first profile. John Ellison flashed a look at Walker and basically told him where to go without saying it. Profanity was something that Colonel Kinzer did not approve of, so everyone was conscious not to use it around him. "How are you going to use your engineer platoon?" Colonel Kinzer asked. "Sir, the engineer platoon is going to emplace cratering charges on this road coming out of Medina directly. That will steer any mounted force to the north or into John's sector. In addition, the engineer platoon is going to reinforce Bravo Company, which has responsibility for that road. The engineers are equipped with 20 M202 flash rocket launchers," Walker explained. "Where the hell did you get those?" Colonel Kinzer asked. "Well, sir, it seems that there were a bunch of them in a bunker at the ASP, and the engineer company commander grabbed them all when they drew their basic load and deployed. I think every engineer platoon in the brigade has them," he said, looking at the other battalion commander, who acknowledged his statement. "Remind me to give an attaboy to the engineer company commander when I get back to the brigade talk," Colonel Kinzer said to the brigade command sergeant major, Marvin Hill. The soldiers commonly referred to him as Marvelous Marvin, but not to his face. He was a hell of an NCO. "Okay, John, let's hear what you have planned," Colonel Kinzer said. "Yes, sir. I have the narrowest sector, being in the center of the brigade sector, and have positioned my companies in depth along the one road through my sector, with A Company on the south side and forward, while Bravo Company will be on the north side and slightly to the rear of Alpha. They'll be positioned so both companies will be able to engage in this area simultaneously. Charlie Company will also be positioned in depth to engage the enemy in this area at the same time, and I'm positioning my engineers with Bravo Company too. If we're paid a visit by any Heinz or other aircraft, my Vulcan section will be positioned with Charlie Company and, if need be, able to engage the enemy soldiers. I've got my scout section out to watch this hill for anyone attempting to flank Alpha. That concludes my brief. What are your questions, sir?" Pausing briefly, he snickered as he looked over at his friend, Mike Walker. "Oh, sir, any forces that Mike and the 1st Battalion can't handle, they're welcome to send them over to us before my guys get bored." Satisfied, Kinzer turned to the 3rd Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hank Sabine. Smart as a fox, Sabine was an ROTC graduate from North Georgia military and had all the mannerisms of a backwoods Georgia boy. "Sir, my sector has 2nd Battalion on my north flank and 2nd Brigade on my south flank. Highway 340 and Highway 60 pass through my sector. I have positioned my scouts out front, watching both roads, and hope to identify the enemy main effort early. A company on the north has an established kill zone, and B Company on the south has set up a kill zone on Highway 60. Charlie Company is positioned in depth with 1 platoon across each highway and 1 platoon in the center positioned to react to either highway. We have emplaced mines in front of both of Charlie Company's platoon positions, as well as along the flanks. The battery of 105 artillery is positioned to support the scouts' call for fires and the companies. In addition, if necessary, he can lay direct fire on Highway 340. "And your engineers, where are they?" Kinzer asked. "Sir, the engineers are concentrating on creating obstacles in front of Charlie Company's 2 platoons," Hank responded. The banter and briefing went on for another hour as they went over their plans. They all knew this was going to be a tough fight. Sadly, they also knew a lot of their soldiers were likely to die over the next few days. It was a somber and great responsibility being a commander in combat. You were oftentimes issuing orders that would result in many of your men being killed or maimed. Yet those orders had to be given to win the day and protect your brothers in arms. Before the meeting ended, Colonel Kinzer informed them the 101st Aviation Battalion had finished establishing their operating base at the Yanbu Airport, 80 miles from their current positions. In addition, a forward rearm refuel point was being established in the vicinity of Al-Musajid, only 30 miles to the southwest. This would place the Apaches substantially closer to the action and allow them to refuel, rearm, and get back into the fight a lot faster than if they had to fly back to Jeddah or Yanbu. Once the brief was over, the group had one final meal together before they broke to head back to their individual commands. They'd hope to eat together again once the battle had been won. 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Alpha Company, 2504th. The night was cool for a desert environment. During the day, the temps had consistently hovered around 120 degrees. Now, with the sun shining bright on the other side of the world, they were left bathed in darkness. The moon had already started its transition across the horizon as the sun began to near its own grand entrance. The downside to the evenings in the desert was the dramatic temperature drops. The temp had decreased to 80 by the dead of night, a full 40-degree drop. Staff Sergeant Alan Murphy had caught a couple of hours of sleep comfortably wrapped in his poncho liner, and shelter half. His feet with his boots on were tucked inside his waterproof bag, keeping toasty warm. Kind of an oddity given the temp of nearly 80 degrees, but his body had become accustomed to the 120 degrees of the day. As he slept, he kept his boots on, ready to run at a moment's notice. His gas mask had oddly transformed itself into a moderately comfortable pillow. Not what the army had designed it for, but a grunt makes do with what he has. His company, Alpha, 2nd of the 504th Infantry, had spent the last 72 hours preparing their fighting positions along what had been dubbed Medina Ridge. They'd built a series of fortified gun positions along the ridge that would provide interlocking fields of fire. Their battalion commander was emphatic about making sure each platoon and company was able to interlace their fields of fire with each other. The ground along the ridge and most of the area around them was sadly bare of any real vegetation. This meant they had to get creative in blending their observation and listening posts, bunkers, and fighting positions. When Staff Sergeant Murphy had built this position with his squad 2 days ago, he'd taken them out 500 meters to their front. Turning around, he'd pointed at their position and told his squad, "This is what the enemy will see." They'd used that perspective to further improve their positions. Stretching as he yawned, Staff Sergeant Murphy removed his poncho liner and stood up in the bunker he'd slept in. The machine gunner was still sleeping while the assistant gunner was already awake. Private Malady was using a heating tab to get some hot water going. Murphy saw a handful of instant coffee and hot cocoa packs nearby, along with a few canteen cup holders. "Morning, Malady. You cooking us up some coffee?" The young soldier looked up. "I am. I was going to surprise you and Specialist Arnold with a cup." Murphy smiled at the kind gesture. "Thanks, Malady. I'm stepping out to take a piss. Why don't you go ahead and get Arnold up?" Taking a few steps away from their fighting position, Murphy took care of the most important business of any day, emptying his bladder. While he was relieving himself, he looked off in the distance and saw some color starting to creep into the eastern sky. It was beautiful seeing the varying colors. This was one of the things he enjoyed about being in the infantry. Sleeping outdoors and waking up to this kind of beauty each day. Then he heard something that snapped his mind into sharp focus. Not sure if he was really hearing it, he stood waiting to see if it came again. When it did, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He moved silently and quickly back into the bunker. In a soft voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Malady, Arnold, grab your weapons and get up." Specialist Arnold, who'd just woken up moments earlier, was about to protest when Murphy crossed the distance between them in the blink of an eye and placed his hand over his mouth. He held a finger to his own lips and pointed out the gun slit. Malady and Arnold's eyes went wide as saucers as they realized what Murphy was trying to tell them. The three of them heard another noise, the sound of some rocks sliding down the hill in front of them. Someone was approaching their bunker, attempting to sneak up on them. Murphy grabbed for his night vision goggles. The twilight was starting to break through the darkness, but it was still just dark enough to cover whatever movement was taking place around them. As he peered through the gun slit in the bunker, Murphy's eyes confirmed what his ears had heard, and his mind had already concluded. He spotted 2 figures moving cautiously up the hill towards his position. They were still probably 50 meters away. They also didn't appear to have spotted the bunker through the terrain, rocks and other material they'd used to help conceal the position. In the green light of the night vision goggles, Murphy couldn't see their uniforms, but the AK-47 was obvious. Both figures stopped and squatted down for some reason. Either they'd heard something that had alerted them to their presence, or they'd found what they were looking for. Across the road, maybe 300 or 400 meters north of their positions, Murphy heard a shot, followed by a second, and then a short burst from a machine gun. Murphy didn't hesitate for a second. He already had his rifle leveled at the 2 enemy soldiers and fired. Malady joined in with his own M16, while Arnold let loose a controlled burst from his M60 machine gun. A swath of bullets raked the enemy soldiers, killing them both instantly. "Stop shooting," Murphy shouted to his guys. "They're scouts. They're trying to find our position so they can call in artillery on us. Specialist Arnold, go tell the others in the squad to stay ready and only fire if they hear us shooting or they spot an Iraqi heading towards them." For the next 15 minutes, sporadic shooting could be heard across the battalion lines as the Iraqis probed them. They were trying to assess where the forward edge of the battle area, or FIBA, as the brass liked to call it, was, likely so they could begin plotting the American positions for their own artillery. When the sun crested the horizon almost 20 minutes after the first shots had been fired, Staff Sergeant Murphy heard and felt the deep rumbling of artillery coming from somewhere behind their lines, likely from the 319th FA, the brigade's artillery battalion. The friendly rounds flew over their heads to some unknown target. Minutes later, Staff Sergeant Murphy and his squad mates began to hear the air above them being pierced and shoved aside by the 100-pound projectiles of the Iraqi 155mm howitzers in retaliation. Murphy had heard from their platoon leader that the Iraqis had acquired several hundred, maybe even thousands of these South African G5 howitzers during their war with Iran. They were specially designed to operate in the dusty and sandy environments of Africa and the Middle East. The G5s had a range of 30 kilometers with the use of a standard propellant. When a base bleed was used, that kicked the range up to 40 kilometers, putting them well outside the Americans' ability to conduct counter-battery fire. For maybe 10 minutes, Murphy and his squad heard the artillery duel going back and forth. They had no idea which side was winning. What they could hear was a lot of explosions to the rear of their positions. Whatever was happening back there didn't sound good. Then the artillery fire shifted. At first it was just a couple of shells. Then it was dozens of shells landing all along the paratroopers' positions along the ridge. Murphy and his 2 soldiers had crawled down to the bottom of the bunker and prayed one of these 100-pound shells didn't land directly on them or even close by. The ground continued to shake violently. Sometimes a round would land nearby, and the 3 of them would bounce off the ground, only to be thrown back into it. The overpressure was awful. They felt like their ears were going to explode, or even their heads, with the constant pressure changes. Murphy told them to keep their mouths open. It'd help. Whatever was going on, it was obvious that the Iraqis were gearing up for a major attack. Murphy was hoping they'd have some soldiers and fighting positions left after this barrage finally lifted. He also had a brother over in Charlie Company. He hoped they were faring better than his company was. Suddenly, the artillery barrage ceased. "Sarge, we got vehicles coming up the road," Malady said, climbing up behind his M60 machine gun and peering through the gun slit. Murphy was on the TA-1 field phone immediately, contacting his platoon leader to see if he knew what was going on. Looking out the gun slit, Murphy nodded at Malady and then relayed what he was seeing. "Sir, this is position 2. I have vehicles, BTR-70s, moving towards my position on the road. I count 6 and, oh shit, I got 5 T-72s following behind them along with dismounted infantry," Murphy said, and then hung up the phone. He had to get his guys ready to stop them. "Arnold, hold your fire on those vehicles. I want to let the TOWs take them out. I'm going to check on the other guys. Malady, listen to Arnold while I'm gone." With that, Murphy half crawled and half crouched as he moved from one position to the next, checking on them after the artillery barrage and getting them ready for the fight of their lives. "Sir, Alpha and Bravo have vehicles moving into the engagement area," the staff NCO said to Lieutenant Colonel John Ellison. "I'm going to move to the western end of Bravo. Tell everyone to hold their fire until the lead vehicle hits the mines. Then I want every TOW to open up on them," Ellison directed. Turning to his fire support coordinator, he ordered, "Send a message back to the brigade artillery and let them know we're going to need a fire mission to those predetermined positions we talked about with them." He then grabbed his helmet and headed to one of the observation posts connected to the battalion TOSI. The OP was positioned just right, giving an observer a good field of vision on the western end of Bravo Company, 200 yards away. As he reached the OP and walked up to look out over the scene unfolding before him, the first BTR-70 hit a mine. Once that lead vehicle blew up, the 20 tow weapons of the battalion all fired on the primary targets, the tanks, BTRs, BMPs, and any air defense weapons that were present. The artillery started hitting the area with variable time-fused HE rounds, creating air bursts that were mutilating anyone that wasn't inside a vehicle. Confined inside the vehicles, the Iraqis found that their visibility was severely diminished. They shot wildly in any and every direction with greatly reduced accuracy. When you added the smoke from burning vehicles to the situation, it was becoming a dire situation for the units. As Iraqi soldiers dismounted from their vehicles, the paratroopers in their prepared camouflaged positions opened fire. The enemy soldiers started to panic as their officers and leaders were identified and cut down. Vehicles at the end of the column began driving backwards to get out of the engagement area. The road had become clogged with burning wrecks of tanks and APCs. Many of the soldiers inside the BTRs and BMPs, however, were dismounting their vehicles to rush forward to the aid of their comrades. Turning to his operations officer, Ellison barked, "Tell Alpha and Bravo to move to alternate positions now. Make sure they grab their TOWs. I don't want those launchers left behind. The Iraqis are going to start hitting those positions with artillery any minute now that they know where they are. Move now!" Staff Sergeant Murphy didn't need to be told twice when he got the word to beat feet back to their next line of defense. He shoved Malady and Arnold out of their positions and grabbed his weapon and the TA-1 field phone. He led his squad to new positions they'd finished preparing just the day before. No sooner had they dropped into the new fighting holes than Iraqi artillery began dropping on their old positions a second time. This second barrage on their old positions was even heavier than the first. The whole area was being plastered by a mixture of ground and air bursts from the Iraqi 155mm howitzers. It was a devastating barrage, one the Iraqi soldiers thought would wipe the Americans out. They'd be in for one hell of a surprise when they reached the positions and found them empty. While the 2504 was patting themselves on their backs for having stopped a major attack in their sector, the 3504 further away from them was still in the thick of the fight. First Ground Attack Wing. Medina Airport. Major Nikolai Kamanin taxied his Su-25 Grach, or Frogfoot, towards the end of runway 18. This plan the Iraqis had come up with was utter lunacy. Then again, it just might work. God help them if it didn't. Reaching the end of the taxi ramp, he waited for the other Su-25 to power up his engines and get airborne. That flight of 4 Su-25s was being led by an Iraqi colonel, a pilot Major Kamanin had actually grown to respect. He was a damn good pilot. Not that Kamanin would tell him that to his face. He was still a camel driver in Kamanin's eyes. The Iraqi flight took off, their engines pushing them down the runway until they had enough lift to get airborne. Giving his own aircraft some juice, Kamanin moved into position. When his aircraft made its turn to get on the runway, he saw a lot of soldiers preparing a couple of SA-6 SAM systems. Other soldiers were preparing many other types of SAMs and AA guns around the airbase. Most of these systems had arrived over the last couple of days. The Iraqis were doing their best to turn the airport into a forward airbase to support their major ground campaign against the Americans. If they succeeded in the next couple of days, they just might be able to push the Americans clear out of Saudi. Facing the runway, Kamanin looked at his wingman, a fellow Russian and veteran of the Afghan War. He saluted, letting Kamanin know he was ready. Returning the salute, Kamanin pushed his throttle forward, giving the engines more power. It didn't take long for his aircraft to get airborne. Even being fully laden down with ordnance, his two powerful Soyuz Tumansky R-195 turbojet engines were more than enough to get him into the air. He turned his aircraft towards the east, wanting to get situated first before they began their attack run on the Americans. The airbase was less than 40 kilometers from the Americans, closer in other areas. Last night, the Su-25s had flown here from Riyadh with nothing more than drop tanks. They'd landed in the wee hours of the morning, and the fuel tanks were swapped out for munitions. Once loaded up, they were refueled and put right back into the air. They didn't want the Americans to realize they'd moved a squadron of Su-25s to the airport, or they'd try to sortie some fighters of their own. Red 1, Mohammed 1. We are heading in. Good luck on your attack run, the Iraqi commander offered. Happy hunting, Mohammed 1. We'll see you in an hour for tea, Kamenan replied. This is a crazy mission, Nikolai. We'll be lucky to get 2 missions in before the Americans catch on to what we're doing and send in waves of F-15s or those Tomcats to come shoot us down, his wingman said over their private channel. Shh. You are not wrong, but let's not attract their attention with our chatter. You and I are going to pay that cluster of paratroopers on the ridge west of Medina a visit. I also want to sweep in behind that ridge and see what kind of units we can find back there. The two of them turned their aircraft and headed towards the American lines. Even from their altitude and distance, they could see the battle unfolding below. It truly was an enormous battle. Maybe the Iraqis had been right to move their squadron this close to the front lines. If they could defeat the Americans here, they could push them out of Saudi Arabia. Slung under each side of their wings was a single S-13 rocket pod, which carried 5 122mm unguided fragmentation rockets. Next to that pod sat 2 S-8 pods. These carried a total of 20 80mm fragmentation rockets. Kamenan's aircraft could hit the Americans with 80 80mm rockets and 10 122mm rockets, thoroughly wrecking any kind of defensive fortification they had built. Approaching the American lines, Kamenan was surprised his aircraft hadn't been painted by any ground radars yet. He realized this was likely because the Americans hadn't realized they had enemy fighters in the area just yet. Well, that was about to change. Follow me in. We're going to hit that ridge those Iraqi soldiers look to be preparing to attack. Let's hit them with 2 rocket pods, then we'll circle around to find another target, Kamenan said over their private channel. His aircraft was currently sitting around 12,000 feet. Still pretty high up. Once he'd lined up on the ridge, he put the aircraft into a steep dive. The people on the ground looked like little ants or miniature people. The American side was shooting down the hill into the Iraqi side, who looked to be gearing up for a charge. They were starting to mass their numbers. Then the Americans on the ground must have noticed him. His RWR started blaring. His aircraft was being painted by some sort of American radar. With his altitude now around 2,500 feet, he depressed the trigger, firing off a volley of 40 80mm rockets across the American positions before he pulled up and began dispensing flares. A warning alarm let him know at least 1 missile had been fired at him. The missile went for one of his flares and exploded harmlessly behind him, a not-so-subtle reminder of how quickly his life could be snuffed out. Tracer fire started zipping around him. He felt a few rounds stitch his aircraft somewhere as he jinked, and then gave the plane more throttle to put some distance between himself and whatever was shooting at him. He instinctively fired a couple more flares and banked hard to the left, then dove. Unbeknownst to him, another missile had been fired at him. It connected with one of his flares and blew up. Damn, that was close. These Americans know how to use their AA weapons a lot better than the Saudis. Looking around for another target of opportunity, he spotted another cluster of Americans in some bunkers, foxholes, and other defensive positions. Turning his plane towards them, he switched over to his 120mm rocket pods. He angled his aircraft down just long enough to line up on their positions and release both rocket pods. Pulling up on the plane, he gave the engines more juice and now looked behind the ridgeline the Americans were held up on. Turning to his right, he saw his wingman was still sticking to him tightly. Kamenan didn't bother looking back to see if his rockets had hit. It didn't matter. He wasn't going back there again. All he cared about was spotting the Americans and hammering them with some rockets, then looking for the next position to hammer. He knew if he hit enough of their positions, He'd create some holes the Iraqi infantry could hopefully exploit. "Hey, boss. If I'm not mistaken, that looks like a lot of artillery. Perhaps we should pay them some love," his wingman called out. "Holy cow! That has to be a full battery of artillery. That is just too juicy of a target." Turning his aircraft towards them, he saw the soldiers on the ground starting to scatter. Some raised their rifles and tried to fire at him. It was useless, as his aircraft was essentially a flying tank. Unless they had a 30mm cannon, they weren't going to harm him. Flipping a switch to his final 2 rocket pods, he lined the battery of howitzers up and started firing rockets. He made sure to plaster the entire area as good as he could. Between him and his wingman, they'd hit the place with some 80mm rockets. They saw a lot of secondary explosions intermixed with a lot of thick black smoke. They'd obviously hit something good. The question now was, how long would the battery be down? How many of their howitzers survived? "Okay, it's time to head home. Let's hope they will let us return to Riyadh before the American fighters show up," Kumanin said. When they reached the airport, they saw the soldiers on the ground had gotten a lot more of the AA guns set up. That was good, but the SAMs were the real threat to the American aircraft. Kumanin also saw that the squadron of Hens appeared to have arrived on the far side of the airport. They were being readied as well. Once his aircraft was on the ground, he parked it in its designated spot. While he was climbing out of the plane, the ground crew was already running towards him. They had a set of fresh, fully loaded-up rocket pods they were going to swap out his empty ones for. A couple of maintenance folks also started looking at the couple of bullet holes he'd taken, checking to see if anything important had been damaged. When he walked over to look at the damage, it was clear he'd taken a few 20mm rounds. "Did they hit anything major?" The mechanic looked at him. "You tell us, sir. How did she handle?" Shrugging, Kumanin replied, "I was a bit busy dodging missiles and bullets and firing rockets to really notice. She got me back home." The mechanic laughed. "Okay, no worries, sir. We'll pull the panels off real quick and check it out. If it looks good, we'll put a temporary patch over it so you can get back in the air. Last we heard, this will be your last mission before they fly you guys back out of here." Kumanin grunted at the news. It was the first he'd heard. Patting the mechanics on the shoulders, he headed into the building to find out what the Iraqis wanted them to bomb next. Colonel Kinzer held the radio hand receiver to his head as he listened to the report coming in from one of his battalion commanders. Judging by the panicked tone in Sabine's voice, things along his portion of the lines were not going well. "Sir, we have 2 columns of tanks and assorted armored vehicles hitting our front. One along Highway 340, the other along Highway 60, just like we talked about during the division brief with General Buckner." Lieutenant Colonel Hank Sabine paused for a moment as he was receiving more information on his end. The sound of machine gun fire and explosions could be heard over the radio. "Sir, both columns are being led by T-72s, lots of them. The infantry's also dismounted. They've moved on the roads and are now attempting to flank our positions while the tanks and the BMPs on the roads provide supporting fire with their main guns. Our T-Abus took out a handful of vehicles, but more than a few of my guys have been taken out. Right now, in our current situation, my battalion is unable to withdraw to the alternate positions. The dismounted infantry has managed to get around our flanks. The brigade artillery is helping, but we need help with the tanks, sir." Kinzer had hoped they would be able to hold things together a bit longer before everything fell apart. "I can't have Sabine's unit getting surrounded and cut off from the rest of the battalion. He's got to break out of his current position and fall back with the rest of the brigade," he thought. His mind was running 1,000,000 miles an hour right now as he tried to figure out what he could do to help his battalion commander. In the distance, Colonel Kinzer heard the sounds of jet engines, followed by more explosions than he could count, all happening in a fast ripple sequence. Holding the hand receiver tightly, Kinzer shouted, "Hank, are you okay?" There was a momentary pause. "Yes, sir. We just got hit by 2 frogfoots coming in low and fast. I think my Vulcan may have gotten a piece of one. Sir, I need some help." Small arms fire could be heard, as well as the chatter of a machine gun, an M60 or PKM. I understand, Copperhead 6, Colonel Kinser replied. Still holding the hand receiver, he turned to his assistant operations officer. Get me General Buckner on the radio. A few minutes later, Buckner came on the radio. Colonel Kinser didn't mince words. Sir, we have a situation in 3504 sector. Hank's receiving the main attack. It appears he's getting hit with too many tanks to handle. To compound the problem further, a pair of frogfoots just plastered most of his lines with rockets. He's requesting a lot of medevac support. I'm going to move my reserves to his position, but we're going to need more help. Is there any way we can get some air or helicopter support? Hell, even more artillery support at this point would be a godsend. Joe, that's a negative on the arty support. I just got word a pair of frogfoots laid a hurt on the division artillery. We just lost an entire battery, maybe more. As to air, I'll see where the TAC air cover is and talk to Sheldon to see if his birds are up. Where do you need them most if I can get you some help? Shit. They took out our artillery. Damn, this isn't good, sir. We needed that arty. Right now, I need whatever helo or TAC air I can get along Highway 340 and 60 in the vicinity of Al-Mufrihat. If we have a breakthrough, then they'll be in the vicinity of Al-Faraish. Roger, I'll get back to you, Buckner hurriedly replied, and ended their call. In the 3504th sector, Lieutenant Colonel Hank Sabine was in a position to observe both engagement areas being with Charlie Company. What he saw was a commander's worst nightmare. His guys were in the middle of a fight to the death with a superior force, and they were running out of ammo. His missile crews had laid a hurt on the Iraqi armor, destroying dozens upon dozens of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers. In the process, they'd chewed through their supply of TOW and Dragon missiles. His paratroopers were now down to using their M72 light anti-tank weapons, or LAWs. The single-use 66mm rocket had an effective range of just 200 meters, which meant his paras had to get close to their targets. They were also utterly ineffective against the Iraqi T-72s. The engineering platoons were using the M203 Flash, with devastating effect on the lighter, thin-skinned BTR-70s and BTR-80s. The more Sabine looked at what was going on in front of his battalion's position, the more he realized the Iraqis were likely to break through his lines any moment. "Where's my mortars?" Sabine yelled to one of his staff NCOs. "They're out of ammo, sir. Nothing more they can do right now other than join the fight with their rifles," the sergeant replied. Sabine could see a look of concern on the man's face. He knew they were likely to get steamrolled soon. Just as Sabine didn't think things could get much worse, he heard a terrible new sound. The unmistakable sound of a ZSU-23-4 entering the fray as they raked his company's lines with 23 mm fire. The large-caliber slugs ripped one of his machine gun positions apart. That gun position had been keeping the Iraqi soldiers at bay, preventing them from bum-rushing their lines. Once it had been silenced, a group of 20 or 30 Iraqis leapt up and ran towards the newly created hole in his lines. A couple of NCOs saw the problem and were already on it. One of the sergeants had rallied a squad of soldiers to follow him as they tried to fill the gap. Sabine got back on the radio to let Colonel Kinser know his position was starting to collapse. Once they were forced to fall back, the Iraqi advance on Al-Mufrihat would be unstoppable. Looking down at his map, he tried to figure out how he could slow the enemy advance. At this point, there was only so much his boys could do. Then he heard another new noise from somewhere overhead. He caught a glimpse of something zipping right over his head, making a swooshing noise, followed by an explosion. The ZSU-23-4 truck that was tearing his lines apart was blown to pieces. Swoosh! A second missile passed over his head, and a tank blew apart, its turret somersaulting through the air. Suddenly, the air was filled with missiles slamming into the armored vehicles. Looking over his shoulder, Sabine could see where the missiles were coming from, but he couldn't see what was shooting at them. Then his peripheral vision caught some movement behind and to the left of him. he caught a glimpse of a OH-58 Kiowa helicopter. The observation helicopter had mast-mounted sight, MMS, which resembled a beach ball perched above the rotor system. This ball-looking device was feeding targeting data to a group of AH-64D Apache helicopters on either side of the Kiowa. As the scout helicopter found the Apache's targets, they cut loose a missile. With each Apache carrying 16 Hellfire missiles, the 8 helicopters were ripping the Iraqi attack apart. When they'd expended their missiles, the helicopters rose up in altitude and started using their 20mm chain guns. They packed 1,200 rounds of ammo for the chin-mounted weapon. The gun was shredding the Iraqi infantry apart just as they were about to overrun the paratroopers' final positions. The remaining tanks and armored vehicles started pulling back to find cover, or at least get out of the killing field of the enemy. Meanwhile, the Apaches continued to use their chin guns to go after the Iraqi infantry and light-skinned vehicles, making sure they didn't leave any pockets of survivors alive. The remaining soldiers were retreating, exactly what the pilots had hoped would happen. When Sabine was a young officer, he'd served 2 combat tours in Vietnam towards the tail end of the war. What he saw strewn about Alpha and Bravo Company's lines and the roads leading towards them was unlike anything he'd seen in his life. The sheer carnage that had been unleashed on both sides was appalling. It made him want to throw up, but he knew he needed to be strong for his men. They were looking up to him. What concerned him most was that this was just round 1, the first attempt by the enemy to root them out. They hadn't traveled across hundreds of miles of desert to give up after one attack. They'd be back. He just wasn't sure his battalion could do anything to stop them.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.